Imagine, just for a second, that you are standing in the dark.
Okay.
You're wearing a heavy plate carrier. The rain is just coming down in sheets, and you have exactly 5 seconds to make a life or death decision.
Oh, wow.
Right. And here's the kicker. The choice you make in those 5 seconds could, literally trigger an international incident. So how do you know in that exact high-pressure fraction of a moment that you're going to make the right call?
Well, yeah, that is a terrifying scenario to put yourself in, because in that split second, the luxury of time is just gone.
Exactly.
You don't have the bandwidth to, pull out a manual. You can't call a committee, and you certainly can't start philosophizing about the nature of ethics.
Yeah, bullets are flying.
Right. The decision in those 5 seconds is going to be made by whoever you already are.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are digging into a highly specialized, honestly fascinating stack of source material that tackles this exact problem.
We really are.
We've got our hands on a read-ahead packet designed for a May 2026 spiritual fitness staff ride. It's hosted by the Catholic men of the chapel at Langley Air Force Base.
Yeah, and the term staff ride might sound like, I don't know, corporate retreat or something.
Right, like a sightseeing tour of a battlefield with some boxed lunches.
Exactly, but the sources are super explicit here. This is a rigorous, demanding decision-making laboratory. It's anchored to real ground, and its entire purpose is to test the moral demands of modern warfare.
So the mission of our deep dive today is to explore how this ultimate ethics laboratory actually functions. We're walking through how a modern warfighter has to balance, cold, hard strategic requirements with individual conscience and virtue.
And to make this tangible, the packet doesn't just deal in abstract theory. It uses China as a real-world, near-peer case study to test these concepts.
But before we jump into the geopolitical puzzle of China, we really need to understand the mechanism of this training.
Right. The how.
Yeah. How does the military actually train its leaders to handle the immense chaotic friction of war? Where does the staff ride concept even come from?
Because they aren't just sitting in a classroom looking at PowerPoint slides, right?
Definitely not.
Well, the methodology has a really deep, rigorous pedigree. It was pioneered by Karl von Clausewitz and Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, two of the most influential military thinkers in Western history.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, and the U.S. Army actually adopted it way back in 1906. The structure is incredibly deliberate. It relies on 3 phases, which are read, walk, and reckon.
Read, walk, reckon. Okay, so first, you read the dense history of a battle.
Exactly. Then you leave the classroom and literally walk the ground where the historical event happened.
Which changes everything, right? I mean, reading about a hill is very different from standing at the bottom of it.
Oh, totally.
You feel the slope, you look at the sight lines, and you realize just how exposed a unit actually was.
It completely shifts your perspective. You feel the terrain, you consider the weather, you understand the physical exhaustion, and then comes the 3rd phase, where you reckon with it.
Reckon with it. What does that mean in this context?
Well, a conventional staff ride usually asks what a commander decided to do tactically. But this spiritual fitness staff ride, it pivots. It asks why they made that call, and more importantly, what kind of person they were in that moment of crisis.
The packet refers to spiritual fitness as the, quote, integrating pillar of military readiness. And what's really compelling is how they clarify this.
Yeah, they emphasize that this isn't just a religious term.
Right. The sources define spiritual fitness as the developed capacity to act on what you know is right, even when it's incredibly costly.
It's the pillar that answers why a warfighter is enduring physical and mental hardship in the first place.
It reminds me of building muscle memory. You can't learn to swim while you're actively drowning.
That's a great way to put it.
And you certainly can't build virtue while the bullets are flying.
No, you can't. And the sources lean heavily on the philosophy of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas to explain that exact mechanism.
Right, because virtue isn't just a switch you flip when things get dangerous.
Exactly. It's a habit. It is built through thousands of tiny repeated choices in your everyday life.
But why the intense focus on this now? Like, the military has been fighting wars for centuries. Why does a 2026 training placket treat this moral muscle memory as this sudden existential crisis?
Because the nature of time in warfare has fundamentally changed.
How so?
The read-ahead packet introduces a concept called the human anchor. We need a human anchor today because modern warfare simply does not wait. The integration of artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons systems, persistent global surveillance, it's all compressed decision timelines.
So what used to take days or hours of deliberation has been slashed down to mere seconds.
Precisely. Technology is essentially moving faster than human conscience can follow.
Wow. And that creates a terrifying vulnerability.
It really does.
Mhm.
The human anchor is the leader who has enough developed pre-existing character to hold command authority in those compressed seconds.
Because if a warfighter hesitates on the battlefield, not out of tactical patience, but out of sheer moral confusion, the entire operation is at risk.
Yeah, and the packet points to historical tragedies like My Lai or Abu Ghraib to illustrate a really harsh reality.
Yeah.
Moral failure at the operator level doesn't stay local.
Right. It inevitably snowballs into a strategic failure at the national level.
Exactly. In this framework, ethical readiness isn't a bonus. It literally is military readiness.
So to test this human anchor under pressure, the staff ride uses a live case study, dedicating a month to examining China.
Yeah.
And what's really refreshing about reading this packet is how it strips away all the usual cable news punditry. It doesn't take a left-wing or right-wing political stance at all.
No, it just looks at the geopolitical map coldly, treating this as a massive strategic puzzle.
And we are going to do the exact same thing here, just impartially exploring the framework the military uses to train its people.
Right, so if we connect this to the bigger picture, the China 101 section of the packet establishes the baseline.
Okay, give us the 101.
It frames China not merely as an emerging power, but as a near-peer competitor operating on a massive, almost incomprehensible scale. We're dealing with a continuous civilization that has basically never disappeared.
And the physical scale is wild. It occupies roughly the same landmass as the United States, but it governs more than 4 times the population.
Yeah, you're looking at about 1.4 billion people.
The geographic dynamic they lay out is striking too. On one side, you have this wealthy eastern coastal region.
Right, the economic engine.
Exactly. Massive ports, advanced tech hubs, sprawling factories. But then you look at the vast western interior, and it serves a totally different, yet equally vital purpose.
It acts as a buffer. It provides immense strategic depth and houses critical energy corridors.
And governing that kind of geography requires a very specific apparatus. The packet details China's unitary system.
Yeah, the Chinese Communist Party fuses political, economic, information, and military power into just a single centralized chain of command.
So when the packet uses the term unitary system, what does that actually look like on the ground? Like, say I'm a tech CEO in Beijing. How is my operational reality different from a tech CEO in Silicon Valley?
Well, in Silicon Valley, a tech company operates independently of the government, right? They often push back against federal regulations or military contracts.
There, we see that all the time.
But in a unitary system, that wall doesn't exist. Civil-military fusion means civilian infrastructure, tech development, and economic policy are legally and practically tethered to state security goals.
Wow. And the military itself operates differently, too.
Yes, the People's Liberation Army does not exist to serve a civilian constitution or republic. Its explicit mandate is to protect the party.
Which brings us to how they compete on the global stage. The sources detail their use of gray zone competition.
Yeah, this involves applying persistent, relentless pressure just below the threshold of open armed conflict.
Gray zone warfare is an exercise in gradualism, right? They use law, historical narrative, economic leverage, and military posturing to accumulate tiny, incremental gains over long periods.
Exactly.
It makes me think of playing a game of Monopoly where one player isn't just buying properties. Instead, they are slowly nudging the board an inch closer to their side of the table every turn,
Yes.
and quietly rewriting the rule book in pencil while you are distracted. By the time you realize they are cheating, the game has fundamentally changed, and what they are doing is technically legal under the new rules.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. They treat time itself as a weapon.
And understanding that massive scale and centralized power reveals why the state operates this way. When you govern 1.4 billion people across a continent-sized landmass, stability becomes the absolute highest priority.
Right, especially carrying a deep historical memory of warlordism and fragmentation. For Beijing, internal order isn't merely a domestic policy goal. It is a matter of sheer national survival.
But this brings up a massive contradiction, doesn't
What do
it?
you mean?
Well, if China's entire global strategy relies on extreme patience, long-term thinking, and this gradual monopoly board creeping abroad, why do their leaders react with such panicked, intense urgency to internal domestic issues?
Yeah, that tension is the core of the case study. And to resolve that contradiction, the staff ride takes the warfighters to China's far northwest frontier.
To Xinjiang.
Yes, to Xinjiang. It's presented as the tragic, perfect example of what happens when a state's strategic requirements collide with extreme fear, overriding justice and human dignity in the process.
The sources compare Xinjiang's strategic role to Alaska. It isn't valued because its population density, it is valued for geography, depth, and natural resources.
Right. It serves as a vital land bridge to Central Asia and a massive energy corridor where major oil and gas pipelines basically converge.
So any instability in Xinjiang directly threatens China's ability to move goods westward. It disrupts the energy feeding that wealthy coastal economic engine we talked about.
Exactly. Now, Xinjiang is home to the Uyghurs, a Turkic-speaking, predominantly Sunni Muslim population. And in the early 2010s, there were isolated acts of unrest and violence in the region.
And Beijing did not view these as local policing issues.
Not at all. They viewed them as an existential threat to the survival of the state.
And that panic triggered the 2014 Strike Hard campaign.
Yeah. The packet details how fear completely compressed the state's decision-making process. Security and prevention just obliterated any concept of due process.
The state took extremism, political dissent, ethnic identity, and everyday religious practice and mashed them all into one monolithic threat category.
Right. Non-combatants were absorbed into a massive machine designed solely for prevention.
Let's pause there because that jump is jarring. How does a state justify looking at someone fasting or growing a beard and legally classify that as a national security threat?
Well, by erasing the line between faith and extremism, the specific mechanisms of the campaign are chilling.
Yeah, ordinary acts of faith like fasting during Ramadan, praying 5 times a day, refusing alcohol, or growing a beard, they were officially reclassified as early indicators of extremism.
And the state implemented total surveillance. Digital monitoring, biometric data collection, and mass detention without trial in what they called re-education centers became the standard operating procedure.
This makes the inclusion of this topic deeply relevant for the Catholic warfighters on this staff ride.
It really does.
Because the Read Ahead packet specifically includes teachings from the Catholic Church referencing a Vatican II document called Nostra Aetate.
Which is pretty profound for a military packet.
Yeah, it explicitly states that the Church regards Muslims with esteem as fellow worshippers of God. So for a Catholic warfighter analyzing this case study, studying the persecution of the Uyghurs isn't just an exercise in geopolitics.
Right. It is a moral imperative to recognize the dignity of fellow believers being crushed under state pressure.
It centers human dignity in the strategic conversation. And here's where it gets really interesting and highly uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah. The security metrics.
According to the state's own narrow, ruthless security metrics, the Strike Hard campaign actually achieved its immediate objective.
Order was achieved.
Right. The packet points out that public dissent largely vanished. Predictability returned to the energy corridors. So what does this all mean? If it worked to secure the region, why is it considered a catastrophic ethical failure?
Because control is not the same as justice. Forced silence is not peace. The state achieved order, but the trust between the citizen and the government was permanently destroyed. Millions of families were fractured. The state traded long-term legitimacy for short-term control.
Wow. And to prevent U.S. warfighters from falling into that exact same trap, making severe moral compromises when they are tired and under intense pressure, the staff ride provides a framework of applied ethics.
Drawn from just war doctrine. They outline 4 ethical maxims. Let's walk through them because this is where all this high-level theory hits the ground.
Okay, maxim number 1. Fear is a poor moral compass.
Which is a really difficult concept in warfare.
Right. I have to challenge this one. In a combat zone, isn't fear exactly what keeps you alive? Why is a military training packet telling soldiers to ignore their survival instinct?
Well, it isn't telling them to ignore the feeling. Fear is an excellent alarm bell. It alerts you to danger. But the maxim warns against letting fear govern your decisions.
Govern. That makes sense.
Yeah, when fear takes the wheel, your judgment narrows. You lose peripheral vision, both literally and morally, and you tend to escalate situations far faster than necessary.
That distinction makes a lot of sense. Maxim 2. Control is not the same as justice.
Right. You can force compliance through coercion and brute strength, but true justice requires recognizing human dignity and adhering to due process.
And Maxim 3. Non-combatant immunity is not optional. You cannot impose collective punishment.
Exactly. The moment you treat an entire population as suspect, just to make your security footprint simpler to manage, you forfeit your moral legitimacy.
Which is exactly what happened in Xinjiang. And finally, Maxim 4 means shape the peace that follows.
The methods you use to impose stability will absolutely determine the character of the peace you have to live with afterward. You can't use brutal means and expect a harmonious peace.
So, to bring these four maxims out of the clouds and into reality, the packet includes a fictional short story titled Floodlights in the Pacific.
Yes, and it takes these grand global concepts and shrinks them down to the footprint of a single base gate at night.
Okay, so the protagonist is an airman named Jace Morgan. He's working the gate during a heightened force protection condition, an FPC on increase.
And for those unfamiliar, that means the base has received credible intelligence of a threat and security protocols are dialed way up.
And this tension is directly linked to the gray zone pressure from China we discussed earlier.
The atmosphere is incredibly tense. A civilian contractor arrives at the gate. His paperwork is mostly fine, but the sponsor's signature is smudged.
And the contractor is sweating, right? He's a bit nervous because he is running late for a job.
Yeah. But Jace's supervisor, Staff Sergeant Dyer, is entirely driven by the urgency of the FPC on alert. Dyer has been briefed that adversaries are constantly watching, constantly testing their perimeter.
He is terrified of looking weak or letting a threat slip through.
So Dyer views this nervous, sweaty contractor entirely through the lens of a threat. He wants to escalate immediately. He demands the contractor's phone.
He is letting fear dictate his actions.
It's the strike-hard mentality playing out on a micro level. Dyer is blowing the line between a minor administrative discrepancy and a national security threat. He is prioritizing immediate control over justice.
But then, the flight chief, Senior Master Sergeant Ruiz, steps in.
Ruiz embodies the human anchor. He pulls Dyer back and says, "Command wants zero surprises." But command also wants legitimacy.
Ruiz makes him verify the paperwork through the proper official channels instead of punishing a guy simply for being nervous.
Right. And afterward, Ruiz explains to Jace that gray zone conflict isn't just about high-tech cyber attacks or satellites in orbit. It's about how authority behaves when it's exhausted and afraid.
If you let your fear turn your operational efficiency into cruelty or punishment, you are doing exactly what the adversary wants.
You are eroding your own legitimacy from the inside out.
What I find so compelling about this read-ahead packet is that it explicitly prompts the reader to apply these military maxims to their daily civilian life.
Oh, absolutely.
You don't have to be wearing a plate carrier in the Pacific to relate to dire stress. Think about your family or your workplace. Have you ever snapped at your kid or maybe an employee, imposing a collective punishment on the whole room just to enforce quiet because you were stressed out and exhausted?
Right.
I know I have.
We all have. And that is exactly what Maxim 2 warns against mistaking control for justice. You wanted relief from your own anxiety, your own exhaustion, so you used your authority to force compliance.
The scale changes dramatically, but the moral law remains identical. Whether it's a massive state locking down an entire province out of fear or a manager yelling at a room full of employees to get 10 minutes of peace.
Exactly. Ethical failure rarely begins with deliberate mustache-twirling cruelty. It almost always begins with justification. We convince ourselves that our fear makes the harshness necessary.
Man, we have traveled quite a distance in this deep dive.
I really have.
We started at the grand strategic scale of China's geography, looking at 1.4 billion people, and the massive energy corridors of Xinjiang. We scaled down to the intensely personal moment of one airman choosing restraint at a rainy security gate, and finally down to how we treat our own families.
And the through line connecting all of those disparate scales is character. It's the concept of the human anchor.
This source material makes an ironclad case that ethical readiness is not a philosophical luxury reserved for academics in a classroom.
No, it is a hard, unyielding operational necessity. The developed capacity to act on what is right under extreme pressure is the integrating pillar of everything a professional warfighter does.
It totally redefines what it means to be ready. Readiness isn't just about how many push-ups you can do or your tactical proficiency. It is about your spiritual fitness.
As we wrap up this analysis, there's one final, really profound piece of the just war doctrine included in the packet that is worth lingering on.
Oh, yeah. The section focused on just ad pacem.
Exactly. Which translates to the causes of peace. It argues that true peace requires addressing root causes. It requires establishing genuine dialogue and finding difficult pathways to reconciliation.
Because peace is not just the absence of violence. It's not just about disarming an enemy or removing a threat from your perimeter.
Far from it. If your means shape the peace that follows, then forcing quiet through dominance only guarantees future conflict.
Think back to that opening question. You have 5 seconds to make a decision, but let's take it out of the military context entirely.
Yeah.
Think about a recent conflict in your own life, maybe an argument at work or a fight at home. When the dust finally settled, did you actually build a lasting pathway to reconciliation? Or did you just use whatever authority you had to force a temporary, quiet compliance and call it peace?